ready for its kickoff. Abe, are you back with us?
I am here. Thank you very much, Joel, and members of Planning Board. So I'm just sharing my screen with you.
We can see it.
So great. Thank you so much, members of Planning Board, for hanging in there. Another epic meeting for you. I'll try to talk in the peppiest voice possible to keep the engagement going. I'm Abe Barge with the Department of Community Planning and Development. I'm joined by my colleague, Josh Palmieri, for an information item presentation on a project that we're kicking off, the Residential Infill Project, which is a big citywide project that we expect to take 2 years, but we're just taxiing towards the runway at this point. So we're getting in on the ground floor with information about our plans for the project. We have a couple of other colleagues that also will be available to join if we have specific questions after the presentation. So just a few of the things that we'll talk about. We just really want to give you an overview of our plans for the project and what the basic objectives are and underlying policy for the project, to give you a heads up and the ability to ask questions and provide feedback at this early stage. And we want to, before really getting into the specifics of this particular project, we want to take a step back and just acknowledge, what we're learning more and more about now, which is the history of zoning and its checkered past when it comes to equity. And I think these are going to be some important things to understand as we embark on trying to meet the objectives for this project. And it's really that, zoning regulations have often historically perpetuated inequality by excluding some races or groups from neighborhoods really around the country, but Denver is no exception. And that the types of housing that are allowed in neighborhoods relates to that. And what we see is, like in the late 1930s, we start having very, relatively more exclusive zoning that really limits housing types to a very narrow range of types, sometimes just only detached homes that may have excluded diverse economic groups from some neighborhoods. And in many cases, that was almost their explicit intent in terms of some of the things that people said leading up to adoption of those zone districts back then. And a lot of things have changed since then, and the neighborhoods have gone in different directions. But I think we still see that history of racial inequality is evident in the way our neighborhoods are structured now. And that, in many cases, we have a lot of great neighborhoods in the city that really don't have a great diversity of residents, or that maybe don't offer opportunities for many types of people to move in and participate in the great wealth that's been generated by owning homes in those neighborhoods as well. And you may be thinking, like, most of us have been starting to talk more about the history of redlining. You might be thinking about that now. Redlining is not zoning per se, but this was a practice primarily in the 1930s that the federal government, at that time, was really seeking to expand home ownership across the country. But the policies that they used to do that included this practice of redlining, which looked, mapped cities across the whole country in terms of like their investment grade for federally supported mortgages. And the quote unquote redlined areas that you hear about were the areas that were shown on those maps as being hazardous for investment, meaning it was essentially impossible to get a mortgage in those areas. And those areas were typically the areas where there actually was some racial integration. There was, there were non-white folks living there, oftentimes alongside white residents. And they generally had a variety of housing types consistent with their economic diversity. Well, when redlining happened and the opportunity for mortgages that were federally supported opened up, not surprisingly, those who were able wanted them. That meant moving out of those neighborhoods and into places that had higher investment grades. Those are mostly in the 1930s. This was kind of the blue and green areas on the map. And the folks that did that were primarily white, partly because they were more economically advantaged. They had the ability to buy homes in the neighborhoods with higher investment grades. In many cases, non-white persons simply couldn't get mortgages even in the areas that weren't redlined. So the integration of the areas that were redlined was degraded because white families left in many cases. And then what we see is that the wall started to go up, and that prior to this era of redlining in the 1930s, Denver had zoning, but the zoning permitted a whole range of housing types for the most part. There weren't zone districts that had very narrow ranges of housing types permitted. As folks moved out into the areas where they could get mortgages, new zone districts were created that were much more exclusive in terms of what types of housing were allowed, including zone districts that allowed only single unit development. And that made it that much harder for the folks that were left in the red line areas to integrate into the developing areas of the city. So thanks for indulging us in that historic background, and now getting to the present and this residential infill project. Before launching into the description, let me just define what infill means for purposes of this project. If any of you have a better name for the project, feel free to let us know. We're very open to it. We know the name is a little bland at this point, but as long as we're using the term infill, which is kind of planning jargon, it really refers to, for this project at least, development that's happening in the city's neighborhoods. So you build a house or a duplex or an apartment building on a vacant lot, or you scrape a house and build something there, that's infill development. Oftentimes you wouldn't really consider like adding new housing units into an existing structure, as was discussed a little bit in the East Central plan earlier tonight, as being infill per se. But just to clarify, that's something that we'll talk about as part of this project. So what the project is a project to implement City Council adopted policy for improved access to residential neighborhoods through more diverse housing choices, while at the same time addressing common concerns about design that doesn't fit with the mass scale and form of those existing neighborhoods, including older homes within them. And then the project, just to be clear, this is an implementation project. So it's appropriate that we're talking about it tonight. It's not a policy project like the East Central Area Plan. This project is about taking those policies that have already been adopted and creating the specific tools to implement them. And that includes some of the recommendations that are in the East Central Plan. And they are broadly, in terms of the citywide recommendations that have already been adopted, to allow for familiar and more naturally affordable housing that can gently broaden our available housing options. So that includes thinking about whether there could be more opportunities for housing types like duplexes, row homes, and certainly accessory dwelling units in residential neighborhoods in the city. The adopted policy documents use the term appropriate locations. What does that mean? I don't know. That's something that we need to figure out as part of the 2-year process of this project. We also want to ensure that the design of new infill construction is sensitive to the surrounding design context, and also more specifically to retain neighborhood heritage and culture through preservation of existing homes, another big topic in the East Central Area Plan process. So I want to turn it over just for the next 2 or 3 slides to my colleague, Josh Palmieri. First, he'll talk about where this project applies. Spoiler alert, we're looking at the residential neighborhoods of the city. That's most of the land area. So Josh, if you can unmute and join and let me know when you'd like to advance the slides.
Yeah, thanks, Abe. And thanks, members of the Planning Board, for sticking around this evening for this rather dazzling info item. We're looking here at the geographic scope of the project, which will consist of all residential low and residential low medium future place types. So you should be fairly familiar with this map or some version of this map. This is the Blueprint Denver future place types map with everything else turned off besides those two districts. It does consist of approximately 75% of the entire land area of the city, so quite a big swath there. Next slide, please, Abe. Yeah, so looking at the adopted policy, Blueprint Denver is that policy that gives us the language to implement these specific tools. Here's a few of the relevant recommendations directly from Blueprint Denver. All of these specific policies live in the land use and built form section of Blueprint Denver. So you see the bizarre acronym at the bottom, at the end of those call outs, it's land use and built form. The first two come from the housing priority recommendations. We actually have a few more housing priority recommendations, 2, 3, 4, and 5 speak directly to the implementation of this project, but we've highlighted a few here, such as diversifying housing choice through the expansion of ADUs throughout all residential areas in the city. So important distinction there. We're also looking at incentivizing the preservation and reuse of existing smaller and more affordable homes. The other two recommendations that we're highlighting here come from the design quality and preservation recommendations. So promoting that contextually sensitive design that Abe mentioned, but also creating equal access tools as far as educating the public on things like sort of conservation overlays, design overlays, and even landmark designation, what that means as far as giving the public the tools that they need to sort of have more control over their neighborhood design and character. So it'll be a large sort of educational component as well while we're out there asking all these questions. Of course, we're looking closely at monitoring what some of our peer cities are doing, namely the Portland Residential Infill Project that was recently adopted, and recently, last year, the citywide Minneapolis sort of single-family upzoning of their citywide recommendations. While our adopted policy is a little bit unique from those, it doesn't directly say we'll eliminate single-family zoning, so we would expect some outcomes that are possibly different than those two cities, but we are looking to see how those processes went. And since, of course, this process is going to take 2 years, as they've mentioned, we're working internally just to work on some general process improvements as far as streamlining permitting and rezonings for ADUs, as well as, potentially moving more of those ADU rezonings to consent agenda items. Next slide, please. Yeah. And so looking at some of the project goals that we've considered coming off those recommendations, we'd like to integrate missing middle housing types, which we're currently defining as 2 to 4 unit structures, but also where appropriate, including row homes. So duplex, triplex, quadplex, and potentially row homes. We'd like to, fully legalize ADUs citywide, but also we need to create some contextually appropriate building form standards for ADUs, specifically thinking about ADUs in the suburban context and where alley access is not currently allowed. There's no access from the alley, so sort of taking on a different form of what the accessory dwelling unit will look like. We also know, we've heard from the community that it's pretty difficult to build an ADU just generally where it is allowed. We've got a couple of conflicting regulatory requirements, sort of some belts and suspenders approaches. And so we'll be looking at adjusting all of those barriers to creating more affordable units, but also better design outcomes, better economic construction practices. We'd like to, of course, in all construction, promote contextually sensitive development in all new forms of housing. So We're very aware of the sentiment that, people feel that new construction is sort of out of scale, out of character, a little bit massy and bulky. And so we're definitely going to tackle a lot of the building form regulations. I mean, it could include things like lowering bulk planes where appropriate, or changing building setbacks, etc. Potentially even looking at reducing lot coverage standards, some sort of sustainability practices as far as how large the footprint of your building could be for a single family unit, things like that. Finally, we'd like to promote additions and expansions over scrapes and replace. We've seen a lot of, smaller homes get wiped out, and another single unit McMansion sort of come back in its place. So we'd rather see more smaller, more affordable units appear and be allowed. So with all that in mind, we'll also have an intense focus on housing affordability and strategies to also mitigate displacement, and hopefully a little bit more of that naturally occurring affordable housing will start to be incentivized. And then finally, despite COVID-19, we are still working closely with our PS staff, with our teammates. We're following all of our ongoing projects. So things like the neighborhood plans, as you just witnessed, East Central has a pretty extensive neighborhood section that kind of takes a deep dive as far as analyzing the neighborhood, the context of the neighborhood, the physical data of the structures that are out there. So we're looking closely at creating those neighborhood pattern books and understanding what that context really is. So that'll help us better inform us as far as what the context should be in the future. How should we rewrite those building standards? And of course, we're monitoring the progress and coordinating with the group living text amendment and affordable housing zoning incentive that is ongoing. So all those projects, and combined with ours with residential infill, we are helping to further achieve our citywide equitable inclusive housing goals, and further push forward our Blueprint Denver standards. So.
Thanks, Josh. So we're getting close to opportunity for questions and discussion, but of course want to mention how important community outreach will be for a project like this. And since we haven't really hit the runway for this project yet, there's plenty of opportunity to think about how we're going to approach it, and we're very interested in your ideas. One of the things we know going in is that we need to put a lot of focus on participation by traditionally underrepresented residents and communities, especially residents who may be vulnerable to displacement. I think need to be very aware of this conversation. So we'll be working on that. And while this project would be primarily conducted by city staff, we do have some resources for the nonprofit Consensus Building Institute and civic canopy organizations to help us with this, including deploying quote unquote community navigators who are already embedded in various communities to help get the word out. Then, because this is a citywide project, we do expect that a lot of the engagement will be pretty focused on surveys, and then certainly, as long as the pandemic is ongoing, virtual engagement activities in order to get the widest variety of outreach, because surveys may be challenging for some groups, and certainly if they're online and require internet access. We hope that our Community Navigators program and our outreach to underrepresented communities, that we will be trying to do fairly high touch outreach with that, which include getting versions of surveys that are offline to specific residents and communities to make sure we get their feedback and can participate in the same touch points in the project as everyone else. We'll do focus groups throughout the project, which would be bringing together folks who may have a particular point of view from the standpoint of, say, historic preservation. So that's something we'll definitely be looking at. We put workshops and open houses at the bottom of the list. As you're probably aware, traditionally in the planning field, we've relied a lot on those types of big events. Come at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday and hear a presentation and tell us what you think. And, you know, I think one of the things that the pandemic has really helped with is show us exactly how limiting that can be in terms of who participates if you rely too much on that type of outreach. Because many traditionally underrepresented residents, for example, just either don't feel comfortable with that type of event or simply can't come at a specific time or get there. And so by doing things more online and in more of a high-touch outreach strategy, we hope to get around that and get a little bit more diverse participation. That said, at this point, we still think we would be putting on big events, virtual at first, and then in person, hopefully at some point during the course of the 2-year project, to provide participants with that opportunity as well, but that not really being the main opportunity for participation. Finally, there's just one particular part of the outreach strategy I wanted to highlight, which is the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. Just because, partly because there's been so much discussion recently about the role of these types of committees. You heard that discussion with East Central. You heard it around the group living project. That, it is very helpful, we think, in the planning department to form committees like this to help us throughout the project understand a variety of points of view from a smaller group of participants who can really agree to take the time throughout the project to be really knowledgeable in a way that members of the general public just simply wouldn't have time to do. And that, we use the group really as a kind of sounding board so that we know whether some of the things we're thinking about might have big issues or whether there are things that we definitely need to investigate or we get good ideas for how to do outreach to the wider community. But we're not really thinking, at least for this project, as the Stakeholder Advisory Committee being really a decision-making body. It is, again, more of a sounding board. That said, we're thinking this committee would have about 20 or a little more participants, that the committee would be a committee of neighborhood residents throughout the city, looking at a variety of different neighborhood contexts, from suburban to more urban neighborhoods, different quadrants of the city, different demographic conditions within neighborhoods and within residents for sure, as well as having some residents that do have particular expertise that's relevant to some of the things that we're talking about. So that does mean, looking for at least some folks that are architects that do work in residential neighborhoods that maybe have more expertise with historic preservation, with affordable housing, with what it takes to do infill development, for example. And we're thinking, just over, this committee would meet just over 10 times over the course of the project. We have a lot of great ideas for who could be on this committee, but we're very open to your ideas as well, either for organizations or for individuals. So we won't take too much time on this detailed slide. And I think we will likely make some course adjustments throughout the project and want to be nimble about that, particularly if we're not getting the right kind of participation, as was discussed in the Central Area Plan. But what we're looking at right now is, as we kick off the project, we'll be moving, as of tonight, basically, into a phase where we're going to try to roll out the project by connecting with stakeholders. And it's really about education. What is the project? Talking more about that equity background to set the stage for taking a little bit of time to define the issues. And because this is an implementation project, we already know a lot. We've got a lot of adopted policy. We certainly heard a lot about what's wrong with design in neighborhoods, for example. There's some discussion of that in the Central Area Plan. There's neighborhoods that are working on conservation overlays. All of that information feeds into this phase of the project to just look at what's happening in neighborhoods and what some of the issues are. By next spring, we go into looking at alternatives. What could be different? What if the development that happened in a certain neighborhood context looks different in a certain way. What if you actually could build some other housing type, like a duplex under certain conditions, or whether you could just add another unit as long as you agreed to keep an existing building. Those are all things to look at. And we'll have a lot of discussion around that, ultimately leading to city staff taking all of that information and putting forward a recommended strategy. So that's where we say, we think the zoning should change to address design in a different way and to allow additional housing options under certain circumstances, and which ones they'd be. And it's where we get really specific. Have discussion around that, make changes, and then actually draft zoning to implement that strategy. And then that would go into a formal zoning adoption process that includes planning board, as you know, probably in about 2 years. And we, talked about the equity background of this project, so just wanted to put up this slide. There's a lot of resources out there to learn more, and I think the PDF version of the presentation that will be on the planning board website will have this slide with the links in it for those that are interested. And many of us in the planning department have recently read The Color of Law, the book that's listed last year, and we have a book discussion group about it. A real eye-opening book that we definitely recommend just to get up to speed on the role that zoning has played in housing inequity across Denver and the country. So we don't have a big dazzling website for the project yet. So in the meantime, though, you're welcome to contact any of the team members listed here. This includes members of the public that may be listening in with any questions or feedback. When we do have a website, it will definitely be linked from denvergov.org/text amendments. There's a little landing pad for it there. So with that, thanks for sticking with us, and we're ready for your questions and comments.
Okay, we have a number of hands up, so we'll just start the queue in the order that I see it here. Aaron, Don, Ignacio, Gosha.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Abe and Josh, and thank you for staying up late with us. And I appreciate the thought that you put into this. I have a number of comments. I'm trying to figure out what order to do them. So first of all, I appreciate the way that you set this out at the beginning and are framing it in terms of kind of the history of inequity and land use and those things. But this particular project preceded kind of the current conversations that we're having that are very specific about land use inequity. So I just wanted to, is that how this was grounded when it was first put together? Was it with that kind of color of law background and other things, or were there other, what was the genesis of doing this project in the first place and kind of coming out of Blueprint Denver?
Yeah, so thanks, Erin. Good question. So there's a lot of discussion around housing options and design in the Denver Right process and Blueprint Denver specifically. Looking through what Blueprint Denver says and notes from that process, it does feel like while the sort of racial equity background was part of the conversation, that a lot of the conversation was a little bit more broad than that and was more, at least on the housing options side, hey, we have a housing crisis, we need to figure out, where people are going to be living in the city and participating and make the city, make housing available to folks who want it across the city and not just in the very particular places where a lot of growth is happening now. And I think that's the genesis of those recommendations that then fed into this project. But as you say, more recently, certainly over the last year and even more so since the pandemic started, there's more and more talk about looking back about, what inequalities have been produced by regulations and what's still remaining. And so we are looking at reframing some of those Blueprint Denver recommendations a little bit more around that at this point.
Okay. So, and I'm in a place now in my life and at this time of night where I try to be blunt, where this is something, when it gets framed solely in the equity piece and in the kind of history of redlining and things, it can come across as reactive to the current moment. I think it's actually important to also frame it in that earlier way, so that it doesn't feel like we've gone away from, these other issues that we have. And like, we're just like, oh my God, we have to fix racism now. Like, I want to make sure that, because, well, this will speak to some of my other comments that I have that are just kind of about the timing of this and just how I have a concern that I'm concerned about backlash. So let me talk about a few things. So one is, you mentioned that kind of the title, residential infill, and you referred to the term infill as kind of jargon. That's something where I think in general, we need to be working so hard, and part of the equity of our processes is making them accessible to members of the community. So if infill is just feels like jargony, then why don't we, marketing language matters. Like, maybe I'm thinking of words like inclusive, and you've said options a lot. So if it's about inclusive housing options, maybe that's what it is. Because if I hear infill, and particularly on the heels of, we are going through the group living text amendment right now, it is facing its own backlash. My concern with this starting right now, with people already, is that people are going to start feeling like, wow, the city is just pushing all of this, these different ways of getting rid of my single family neighborhoods, and won't hear the substance of what is being proposed here, because there's just this feeling of being oppressed in some way, in a weird way, or just feeling like, okay, this keeps happening now. Okay, we just dealt with that. Now you want to talk about this. And I hear you say the distinction between group living is about the households, and here we're talking about house types. But to a lot of people out there in these neighborhoods, that is a distinction without a difference. Like, it's going to feel like you just keep trying to put all this other, just adding all this density, and I haven't asked for it. And so I think it is important to tie it to Blueprint Denver very clearly, because that is a community plan, and be like, no, we didn't just make this up. George Floyd wasn't killed and then we decided we're going to do this to you. It needs to be like, this is part of that. It needs to be part of the history in terms of how this is rolled out, that this did not just show up and we're not being reactionary. This is something that we agreed as a city to incorporate more of these types of things, and this is our way of doing that. And so I just think that the way this is rolled out, and it being in plain language and being about all of those things, is going to be critically important. The final thing I want to say is just with the stakeholder group, I just want to really commend you to, like, I've been a part of some of these stakeholder groups. Whenever we're hearing about these plans, we hear about the stakeholder groups. And while we regularly have neighborhood residents as parts of these groups, I feel like even then it's still the same usual suspects. We need to dig deeper. We need to find people who are not regularly a part of these processes. That's how you're really gonna get some meaningful feedback. Like, really, put people who, go find someone who hopefully has the time, but maybe they've been interested, we don't know, but like, not just because I think when we think of Elyria Swansea, there's like these 2 or 3 people who we regularly get. And if it's Park Hill, there's these 2 or 3 people. And it can't be just the ones that we already know all the time. And so I would really just ask for you to work hard to find some people who have not been a part of the process so that we really do get a broader variety of voices, particularly on a group like that.
That's great, Erin. Thanks so much. That's really good feedback. And I think, yeah, just to clarify, this project, is about housing for everyone. It's not just about the racial history of zoning. And these projects are coming very close on the heels of each other, partly because we know there's such a crisis in housing, and Blueprint Denver acknowledges that. And so we're moving forward quickly to address a lot of related things with housing, and the Affordable Housing Zoning Incentive and group living and this project all do relate together, and we're in very close communication about them.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really great feedback. And there is, the design aspect is a really large component of it. Maybe we didn't do a good enough job of highlighting that aspect, but the other half is that pushback from ugly buildings. We've gone through the slot home issues. We've gone through now these big funky stucco boxes, and so Blueprint really has a lot of sort of recommendations towards that as far as contextually sensitive design. And so that's the other sort of big 50% of the project. So we'll spend a lot of time doing that and making sure we get those aspects right and make sure people are more content with the type of development that they're getting in their neighborhood. Not that we want to go ahead and expand on the code, add another 100 pages of context, but we'd like to take our chance to really tighten the screws a little bit and make sure our contexts really are working the way they say they should be.
And I think that's a really important thing to highlight, and just overall that this is in response to what was heard from folks across the city. This is not here the planning department is being like, well, they did this in Portland and that looks good and we need to do that here. And it's not like we're jumping on some bandwagon of, this is the latest thing in planning. Like, I really think it's important to make sure that it stays grounded in what we've heard from the community, and this is our way of implementing that.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Erin.
Okay, done.
Okay, I have a few quick comments. I will make them very brief. Amen. You said it's not, you kind of joked it's not dazzling. It's dazzling me. And it's because it gets at this issue that it's a way of getting our housing stock to align with our housing needs without relying on new building, sexy new projects, which are going to be done with new dollars and new construction. So I'm really excited. It reminds me of debates I had with Peter Park years ago, where I got to say, hey, if you really care about form, then why couldn't this single family looking house have 2 units? And if you care so much about the duplex farm, why couldn't it have 3 units, as long as I couldn't tell it? And I never made any headway at all. Peter's like, no, single family, and duplex is duplex. And I didn't make any at all. But the truth is, if we're a form-based code, then we should have some more flexibility in usage. I want to amen almost everything that Erin said. Be careful. The issue is not whether this is the right thing to do. The issue is, and frankly, I agree with her completely. This is an affordable housing issue at a greater level than it is a redlining history undoing issue, because that's both of those are very serious. The issue is the public is going to feel under attack. You will not be, that they feel they have been under attack out of the group living, and now you've hit them with a right cross and you're going to hit them with a left on. When will you guys quit? And the answer is, we need housing. And the answer is, no, you need to stop hitting me. You got to stop hitting. I'm not listening until you stop beating my neighborhood. And so I'm very serious. I think you have to distinguish them, but the way you distinguish them is going to have very much aimed at marketing and being extremely sensitive rather than saying, oh, no, let us explain the difference between occupancy and dwelling units. What is perceived at, you just approved 5 to 10 in a dwelling unit and then told me my neighbor could have 2 dwelling units. I can't take it anymore. So I'm serious. This is going to be a serious problem. And you're saying the right words. I'm just warning you, there's a grenade in the room and the pin has been pulled halfway out, and somebody better figure out a way to handle it. In terms of outreach, I would encourage you heavily to do what you did in Eater. Focus on renters. Focus on renters, because they're going to have more and more people in that bucket. If you're an owner in a marginalized neighborhood, you may be looking at, you may want to stay, but you may want to sell out at top dollar, or you might be a speculator who already bought the property. I'd be very careful to just make sure you get a lot of predominance of people who are renters, not owners on these areas. Last two things. Careful not to say, we're going to eliminate single family zoning. I'm making a personal statement. Minneapolis can say that. It gets a lot of press in magazines, scares the pants off most of America unnecessarily. Look at Germany, look at Japan, look at Kampala, look at Nairobi. America's desire for single family housing is not an American brainwash. It is a almost universal human desire to have a house with a lot. Yes, I would be just as happy as an apartment. Maybe yes, you would. But this is an international phenomenon. There's painting single family houses on single family lots as evil, as raw in some moral sense, is a losing battle, and the world proves it's not true. It is a global aspiration for much of humanity. The question is, how do you modify it so it's not exclusionary? How do you modify it to mitigate the racial impacts of it? How do you modify it so it's not the default? How do you modify it so that it changes where it has to? But kind of, being the second city in America to say we're going to dismantle single family zoning wins you a little clapping by the planning department in Minneapolis, and you lost the battle. And you lost the battle unnecessarily, because it's not an evil. It's the way it has been overused and used discriminatorily. And that's where the focus has to be, rather than we're here to tell you that the way you like to live is wrong. And finally, last thing is, as you evaluate where single family zoning might need to be leavened, allowed 2 or 3 or 4 unit duplexes, just be real careful about the real world market impacts of this. I wish we'd spent about 10 minutes longer on this with group living than we did, because we can have a facially neutral law that says everybody in Denver, or everybody on an arterial corridor, or everybody in this neighborhood now use their property in more flexible ways. And we can pretty well predict where in the city that will happen. And if we're not careful, you want leavening it in a way that the current single family exclusive neighborhoods stay that way, but the places like Montbello that were complaining about the group living because they were already overoccupied are going to say, guess whose house is going to be bought and turned into a duplex? It's not Don Elliott's house. It's not somebody who lives in East Central Denver. It's going to be in a lower income neighborhood. That's who's going to have this happen. So I very, very much urge you to have a real world market oriented filter on this as you go down the road. Okay, we can write the words. Where is this likely to happen actually, given market forces, and how do we prevent that from perpetuating the racial and economic impacts of what we're doing here? So, enough said.
That's great. Thanks, Don. I agree with everything that you said. And I think, you're right that we don't want to paint single unit houses as evil, because they're not. And that's not what this project is about. It's about housing options and, ways in which more people can live in the neighborhoods that are mostly single units that people love. That is definitely something that people love. And on the renter question, please, anyone on the planning board or otherwise, if you know of folks who may rent their homes and would be interested in engaging in a project like this, particularly if they're folks that fear displacement, we would be really interested, because it's always challenging to get participation on that front. And I think you're right that it's very important. And then on your question about market realities, yes, that's a big concern of ours, that we certainly understand that just making things allowed doesn't magically make them happen. So on the one hand, we need to understand that they actually would happen sometimes under some circumstances, and which ones they are, and that it isn't just all in Montbello, for example, or all in places where you know, a lot of things have already happened, because this is about housing options citywide. So if it's just more housing options in certain places, that just doesn't work.
Great, Ignacio.
Thank you. Wow. So let me start a few ideas, but let me start with the easy one, which is kind of where my mind goes straight away to the kind of the marketing side of this and how you name it and so on. So yes, you're right. Residential Infill Project doesn't have a ring, but the word has to do with fill. And it is not a refill, because there are certain neighborhoods that actually have not been filled in the first place, so you cannot refill them yet. But there is truth that you should be talking about fulfill. And it may be a play of words, but if you talk about Denver fulfillment or Denver fulfills or residential fulfillment or whatever it is, where really you mean what you say, and what you're trying to do is to fulfill the potential of the neighborhoods. I think that maybe there is a branding opportunity there with that one word. So that's where my mind went immediately. I do think that this has to do, I mean, the way I read it has to do with the racial history of Denver, and those neighborhoods that were the tier 4 in your residential security map from 1938, those neighborhoods are still the focus. And if you continue to develop this story, it will focus back on those neighborhoods. And I mean, look at Central Park, for instance. From Quebec to Syracuse Court, you have a pretty much mixed neighborhood. From there to the east, you have a completely homogeneous culture. And can you talk about fulfillment there? Can you talk about social equity and social justice? Maybe not, because this is actually, well, within the already developed parts of the neighborhood, you have already missed the opportunity. Yeah. So you talked about Montbello. That is kind of the same case. So I would not shy from the fight that Don was talking about. Not that you are actually going to have to wear a suicide vest and basically just implode the project. But I think that the conversation needs to be taken place. Yes, we're not against single family housing, but I mean, in your fact finding, I urge you to look into the history of the map that you showed and try to see where are the financial and physical links to the past, because if you can put a number to the missed opportunities for the communities, and it's not just the Latinos that live there and the African Americans that came later, it is a whole bunch of other communities that were basically in the tier 4 of your map, were segregated and we're taking opportunities from. So can you put a number to that? Because there's the equity issue. And I'm not talking about reparations, although that would not be a bad idea to talk about either. So I'm going to stop there because you know, I wish I had the capacity to put all these ideas into a policy statement that I could give to you and so on. The next point that I wanted to talk about, and the last one, is the regulatory side. You talk about design, and it is really difficult to have design put into some kind of guidelines or standards and so on. But it is doable, and it is doable within a form-based code, as Don also just mentioned a few minutes ago. So don't shy away from the fight, but have a fight that is productive, that you have different opinions at the table, and maybe it is the homeless coalitions as well who should be at the table here. Because you're really talking about a much bigger problem. That in the previous case that we were looking at here, I was like, hold on, we are looking at homelessness with a paternalistic view. Can we create the opportunities to bring the grassroots movements into the planning process? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignacio.
Thank you. Gosha.
Wow, that's a great discussion at 9 o'clock at night. Thank you all. I'll try to respond to some of the things that have been said before and build on it. I responding to Aaron's comments, I think, you know, just like Don, I had the same conversations with Peter Park about why is there just only one unit in a single unit home? Why couldn't it be 2 or 3? And what does it mean that we have form-based code? I think, you know, in those years, we were really not allowed to talk about this racial equity. Like we knew about it, but it wasn't a topic that was highlighted. And it's just really the recent events that kind of empowered us to bring those issues up. And I find myself showing the video segregated by design at various contexts, and this is new, and I think it's important to talk about it, and I wouldn't shy away from it. Just because it's a new, I guess, allowance to speak about it doesn't mean that it's a new conversation. And to that point, I think, you know, point about duplexes, fourplexes, I think back in 2010, when we were having these conversations with Peter Park, building a duplex was actually an affordable option. It no longer is. Right now, it really takes a fourplex to achieve the same level of affordability. And in my mind, that's really important talking point, is that affordable housing, that I think right now the inventory needed is somewhere around 26,000 units. And there's expectation in the community that a city would somehow deliver those units and through some kind of magical subsidy. And there's just not enough subsidy in the world to provide that many units. So we really have to think about market solutions or just market-driven solutions that would deliver that affordable housing. And I think this is one of the tools. And we have to talk about the density in that context, that really duplex, again, does not lead to that affordability. I think there's important conversation about incentivizing building size tied to number of units and affordability. I think Portland did really good job at it. I would like to learn more about how they got to that level. I guess my final point is thinking about the process. I think, again, I think Portland is a good role model, although it took them 6 years to get to the point where they are today. And they ended up with a pretty significant community support. So I would like to learn more about that process and learn also from our mistakes, I think, from the group living, because I think that's a similar issue at hand. And a similar conversations like others said. So how can we improve on that process to get to a different outcome? And I to me, the conversation really is about the like very basic common denominator, which is just shelter. Like, how do we shelter humans in Denver? What are the tools provided for us? And I think this is important tool again, that where market can deliver affordable housing, and we're talking about DPS teachers. So I think this is a type of housing. What kind of policy do we need to implement so that DPS teacher can afford to buy a home in Denver? And I think if we don't arrive at a solution to that question through that process, then we probably didn't do our job.
Great, thank you, Gosha.
Heidi was next, and then I have Andrew and Angel.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks so much for this great presentation. I'm not going to. We've had a very thoughtful conversation so far, and I'm just going to give you some practical ideas in terms of outreach. OED is funding a Nest or funding housing navigators that you may be aware of, and they might be a really good resource to get the word out into the community and actually to identify people who should be on the task force or the advisory committee. I think 20 to 22s are kind of big, and we typically sort of look at like 15 as a max, so maybe rethink that a little bit, and then I'd maybe think about people who are actually occupying or own duplexes and fourplexes, carriage homes, and I think you need the experience of somebody, particularly like a family with children, who's living and successfully living in a home like that and is an owner. And then on the survey, I would not use any visual like pin drops or anything if you're doing like trade-offs or visuals that somebody who's visually impaired couldn't see, because that isolates a lot of people who use screen readers. And then last but not least, I would make sure you've got representation from people with disabilities, because a lot of these are really, really good housing solutions, not only from an affordability perspective, but from a care perspective for people with disabilities. So I know you all have worked with Atlantis or Adapt, but reaching out to them and making sure that they've got representation, I think would be really good as well. Thank you for this project.
Thanks. Yeah.
Andrew.
Yeah, as everyone said, thank you. And I think anytime it's at the beginning, everyone's like, it's very excitable because there's just so many directions you can go. I think, depending on your personality, you think of like, oh, what is all the upside, which I think there's a lot. And I naturally kind of think a little bit more of unintended consequences. And so I think, and as we know, things are changing so quickly that just like as a philosophy, being malleable and having those metrics is obviously something that's pretty important from the foundation. I have a little concern with how we use Blueprint to direct us. I know that like it is the overall guide for what we need to use, but I know very specifically with that map and the low and low medium map that during that Blueprint process, it was just somewhat copied from, hey, here's what the current zoning is versus like, here is what our goals are. And I think that you're going to have some must be late because I don't have any words, but some things that will not work with each other. And so I think there should at some point in the process really have a deep look into, hey, is the way the map is in Blueprint Denver the way it should be for what our goals are? Because I think there's some opportunity for that component to be missed. So that's one component. I think just the process and potentially talking to architects and developers. Like I know a developer that said, hey, you know what, the zoning will allow, it's like doesn't matter what the zoning is, it's a 6250 lot and they can build 3 units or 4 units on it, but they won't, because they'll only build duplexes on it, because as soon as you go to that third unit, it goes to a different process that makes the build time substantially longer. And then that kind of disincentivizes them to actually build. So they will never build that way. And I think, you know, again, it's that kind of like seesaw balance of, hey, let's get things done the right way. But you also need to make sure that process on the actual applicable, like how do people actually do this component work? And I think sometimes, you know, that's where like same thing, zoning doesn't necessarily always fit with the real world. And then the last one, and the one that just like really does scare me the most throughout this process, is some form of that design review. You know, ADUs, I kind of understand it quite a bit more, at least for like some templates, and it's in the back of the lot, so it's not as much of a design feature as it is like, hey, let's just get a mass amount of people comfortable with it. But I think it is very difficult to be culturally sensitive and have design review, and then also know where that line is that's appropriate. You know, I brought up the example many times, but you can do it all the design review you want. If you're not dictating color, like people are still going to be really upset at the outcome because people are really creative in what exterior colors they have. And then, you know, in my mind, as they should be. So I think, you know, very excited to see how this process goes. But you know, I think it's just like, it's such a big thing to look at right now. So I think definitely re-looking at those blueprint maps is probably my biggest thing.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And just on the issue of the blueprint map, I definitely agree. I think we're using that map to sort of show us where the areas that those recommendations definitely apply in Blueprint Denver. But I think that as the process goes on, we can look at where it really makes sense as the conversation takes shape. And that means we're not necessarily 100% limited to that, or that, you know, everything we talk about applies everywhere on that map, for example. And then on design review, just for anyone that may be listening, that would be a tool additional to zoning that would be a more case-by-case qualitative review of designs that are proposed. And, you know, I don't think that's necessarily something that's off the table in this discussion, that, you know, we would share some of your concerns with that, and there's certainly a big administrative burden with that. So we'd probably first look at, you know, actually, are there things that the zoning already does, height limits or the way that height is measured, or setbacks, that could be adjusted to get us better results, and that's where we would start.
Great, thank you. And I think with that too, and the design review, I mean, I think the market really dictates a lot of what people actually like. So there will always be a one-off, but I think ultimately, like the test of time, at every period of time, a tutor was ugly at some point, you know, like by levels, there's different components that depending on the moment in time, people didn't like it. And, you know, if it tested time, then it was probably appropriate. So thank you.
Thank you. I see Angel, and then Don and Heidi's hands are up again. Angel.
Okay, I just wanted to make 3 quick points, and I had an opportunity to speak with Abe, it's been a couple of weeks ago, about this project, and you know, agreed to be involved in a larger capacity. That was before I knew we had 6-hour planning board meetings every time. So I was just joking. But just a few thoughts. My sense is we will always have unintended consequences with these plans if we don't put a focus on removing barriers. And I feel, you know, in terms of framing this, which is another one of my points, there's opportunities for every community, and that's got to be the focus as well. There's opportunities for people to age in place, which is what I heard was a big goal for folks that have too much house as they get older in years, and they have kids that may not be able to afford what's out here at this juncture. And they have grandkids that may be coming home from college. How do we give people opportunities to accommodate all of that. There are ways for people to build wealth with additional, ADUs, duplexes, that sort of thing. So I think we frame it, obviously, in a way that makes everybody get excited, except for those people that are going to line up at these meetings, I see, and say they don't want it in their neighborhood. But I think there's a way to get a good amount of people excited about the opportunity. The unintended consequences are that there's predatory folks, there's people that beat everyone to the punch because they have fewer barriers, and that makes unintended consequences in primarily low-income communities. And so I think taking zoning, removing barriers wherever possible, costs, accessibility to capital. And we would be very cutting edge figuring that out. A lot of these plans wind up for a lot of people feeling theoretical because you just don't have access to do it. It gets done to you, just like with the recession years ago, houses were upside down in this community of Montbello, and investors swooped in, and people were saying, oh, I should buy one. This house across the street, 3,000 square feet, $80,000. I didn't have $80,000, but investors did, and they bought that one and that one and that one and that one and have rented it out. Those are going to be the same people that take advantage if we don't, not as an afterthought, but as a forethought, begin to think, how do we make this accessible and make it an opportunity for everybody? It's going to look different for different communities. And so it makes for a lot of work. And that goes to the third point about who needs to be involved on this, in this process and steering committee. I think there are folks that I think everybody must be equity minded and have in their mind there's not going to be a one size fits all. This is not theoretical. I'd love to see a process that was practical as it gets. There's folks out here that they go to work, they may be blue collar, but they come home and they build. Who are these folks that know how to get things done cheaply? They know how to work within the guidelines and within the rules, and they know how to work the system, and they know how to build onto a garage, and that can guide the practical how to do this. Otherwise, you're going to have people that are able to take advantage of this, and those that get taken advantage of because of this plan. And so my caveat would be that it's a very accessible plan, and we give different ways for people to get involved. It's very intimidating to ask somebody to be involved for 2 years. And so smaller, phase one group, that spends 3 months, brainstorming, giving everything, all their ideas, phase two group or focus group, or, just smaller bite-sized ways for people to be involved, because yes, you will turn away a lot of people saying it's a 2-year plus commitment.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angel. And you mentioned aging in place. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that gets back to the housing options for everyone that Dawn and Aaron brought up, that, if those of you that are lucky enough to have a grandmother or grandfather, it's about where do they live, and hopefully it's close to you.
Thank you. Gosha.
Yes, sorry. Just a quick few points I forgot to mention. One, I think it's important to have the distinction between single-family housing and single-family zoning, just because I'm not shy about advocating for eliminating single-family zoning. That does not mean that we cannot build single-family housing. There's single-family homes in downtown Denver, and they can be built in most residential zones, all residential zones and mixed-use zones. So I think it's important distinction to make. And the second comment is more technical. It kind of builds on what Andrew was saying about 3 units, that it kicks it to a different kind of review. And there's similar challenges with building codes. Once the building has more than 2 units and they're not row homes, it becomes a commercial project. It falls under an international building code as opposed to a residential building code, which comes with all kinds of requirements, commercial sprinklers, etc., which makes those construction really expensive really quickly. So that's just something to kind of not lose sight as we think about these projects and building forms, that there are technical limitations or challenges that we should address with fire marshals and building code officials.
Thanks, Kisha.
Great. Well, I'll just wrap up with a few thoughts here. I'm happy this is starting. There are so many things we put into Blueprint Denver and the community responded to and found acceptable. I'm sure not everybody could envision how they play out, and there's a lot of different directions they could play out, but this is going to make progress on some of those bigger ideas in, as you said, most of the land area of the city. And really in a way that, just like most of our houses were built, most of our houses, the individual houses weren't built by a master developer building out an area. That's a newer kind of suburban phenomenon that happens in some places in the city, but a lot of places in the city, one by one, a couple here, a couple there. And one element of creating more housing and more affordability is going to be regulating for and incentivizing, not with money, but with regulation, people adding their own ADU, people subdividing their house, or whatever sorts of things can come out of this. In terms of messaging, some of my colleagues were talking about messaging, framing, terms. Those are all really good things. I just want to remind us that Blueprint Denver had a term that I love, and I wish I knew who found it, complete neighborhoods. So housing options, a variety of housing options, a variety of things you can walk to and do, and so not a monoculture of housing options. So I just like that complete neighborhoods. I've also heard somebody say reversing the ban on duplexes, reversing the ban on townhomes. So talking about the exclusionary, one form zoning for the entirety of a neighborhood. Maybe there's a mixing, maybe there's edges, maybe there are corners. However it plays out, it just struck me. I never thought of it that way. That our zoning kind of bans options and bans complete neighborhoods. The Sightline Institute in Northwest presented some data from Habitat for Humanity that I found particularly approachable for those of us who are not in the business of housing. We're not in the business of construction and development. And it was through the lens of, let's say you wanted to make an affordable housing unit and you had a residential lot, and these were examples from the Northwest, so things were sized the way Portland lots are sized, but the core idea remains, how much would it cost to acquire the land and build a house? And then how much would it cost to buy down that house to the point where it was affordable for, a target AMI, 60% AMI, I think they were using in that example. If you were on that same lot allowed to build a duplex, a triplex, a quadplex, the efficiency of use of land and construction drives the cost of construction per unit down, and therefore the subsidy needed down. Well, that same perspective works, of course, even if you're not subsidizing affordable. They just are more affordable because they cost less to build. And I think there'll be a time and a place for trying to share with the community those basic economics that could be helpful, whether it's that exact example or not. I was impressed by the clarity of that document. One of the recommendations in Blueprint Denver we haven't talked about for a long time is cottage housing. So where you might have a row house, with 4 units, could you have 4 detached units sharing a common courtyard? I don't know if that's in or out of your scope, and maybe you haven't decided yet, but it's an interesting approach that if we think of our residential low neighborhoods, for instance, and low medium as low scale, and I'll sometimes use this term, our low scale residential areas. These are low in scale. They're a little more dense, so small, affordable, shared for people who want that kind of community, close but not attached. It may have a place in this effort. Gosha brought up building code. I hope that where necessary, this package that comes out in a couple of years will consider building code changes as necessary. Because there could be one or two crucial things that make the difference between good ideas being possible and not, whatever they may be. And again, I like Gosha and other people's emphasis on a prototype in the mind of who are we trying to help with this, whether it's Angel saying, you know, aging in place, or Gosha, think of a teacher and what income level our teachers are paid. Stabilizing, the West Denver Renaissance Collaborative talked a lot about ADUs for a family to stabilize their housing situation against the buffets of housing price appreciation and property tax appreciation and just the things that could befall us in life with, you know, loss of a job, etc. Having some diversity of income, living, you know, if you subdivided a place or had an ADU as an income property, or multiple families or extended families staying together, that idea of stabilizing might find a home here. Someone, I didn't make a note, who talked about renters. Yeah, absolutely. 50%. 50%. And what's the level of participation in our neighborhood groups? What's the level of participation in our public processes? It's not about trying to have a small representation representing a small representation of the population. It's about half of the folks who live in the city. So somehow that has to be unlocked, not just a few people on the steering committee or the advisory committee, but fully participating in this. And that may cause some dialogue that doesn't normally happen between those who normally participate, who tend to be owners, and those who are renting. Finally, having watched the Ludi committee meeting yesterday with group living, and there were a lot of concerns expressed. You know, I have my opinions about the particular concerns and where they're coming from. Certainly, some things that were said were simply not true, like the advisory committee being mostly commercial interests. But my point here is the advisory committee to some degree is becoming a target. And we can't let that happen here. Councilwoman Kniech described it very well, that when that group was assembled 2.5 years ago, we were following a model of, okay, let's get some diversity in various dimensions, in terms of geography and in terms of ethnicity, etc. But it wasn't the overriding emphasis. I know that starting out with this, it will be the overriding overriding emphasis. And yet, what will inevitably happen as these folks spend more time on this topic than the general public, they will become more sophisticated. And I don't mean that in any elitist way. They'll just spend more time rolling these ideas around in their head, having dialogue about them, and their level of familiarity and comfort with whatever the direction is that emerges will start disconnecting them from their ability to be the sounding board you need them to be regarding the public, because they themselves will no longer resemble the public because they've spent more time with this topic. I think part of the answer to that could be 50% of the time, 50% of the effort, 50% of what you get out of that advisory group should be advice and actual work on how to do outreach, on where to have meetings, on how to reach groups that are not participating, on how to raise everybody's level up in terms of participation and being conversant with these topics. Otherwise, you can have some great discussions with people who will, through no fault of their own, resemble less and less the people who weren't along for the ride. And then you'll have a package that you bring out to the public who weren't along for the ride and have to catch them up really quick. And then that group is going to be a target, the way some are treating the Group Living Advisory Committee as a target today. Those are just a few thoughts.
Great, thanks, Joel. And just one thing to mention, based on all your good comments, the cottage housing is a housing type that's specifically mentioned in Blueprint Denver. And yes, I think it's something we want to consider. It's an option for a low-scale residential neighborhood.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I love that you stayed tied to that idea, Joel. I'd love to see, maybe that's one of the barriers that we have to entry to home ownership, is that maybe our minimum lot size is too great. You know, how many people can afford a 3,000 square foot lot now? Do we need to readdress that idea? Can we reduce that to 1,000 square foot lot with a, 600 square foot footprint home?
If we're thinking of language and some of the things that my colleagues have said with, think of teachers, think of stabilizing, think of aging in place, another term that you don't hear a lot, that cottage housing in particular, in terms of a detached house type, could connect with, is a starter home.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's exactly, it's smaller, it's on a smaller property, but it's a detached home. If you're thinking of starter home in the detached single family kind of sense, it's the place you live if your life path is going to increase your family size, but it's not there yet. It's a smaller place, and you could own it, and you can have equity, etc. Don.
Yeah, just a quick comment on this lot size issue. Everybody should be aware that Aurora, I led a project in Aurora a couple of years ago where they got down to a minimum lot size of 1,800 or 600 square feet. And it was a very painful process, but it was driven by economics. And so, I mean, I'm glad to hear Josh said what he just said. There are numbers, and those of us who live with those numbers for a long time realize they're not absolute. And basically, allowing more house on less land scares people. It is in fact extremely powerful way to get at housing economics, and our neighbors are doing it. So enough said.
There's a related topic about ADUs. One of the surprises that came up for me with ADUs was that outside of SU districts, although the house and the detached ADU are on the same zone lot, nothing prevents them from being separately owned. And that's another starter home, the ability to build equity that's possible today. It's not super well known because we haven't mapped the availability of ADUs in many places in part. But I think another thing in the scope here, because scope creep is real, is re-looking at those very defensive, very, very concerned about any possible waves that might be caused by ADUs, those very restrictive SU ADU requirements. Maybe now that we've had some time with it in some places, they can be different in some way that especially that helps that starter home idea. I know there's a lot of anxiety around short-term rentals and a lot of regulation to respond to that anxiety. And I shared a lot of that anxiety in terms of taking units off the market, off the rental market, to use them for short-term rentals. So I think all that regulation is appropriate. But if you can then channel instead an alternate approach, which is towards starter homes, towards multiple owners on the zone lot of the different structures, providing more housing and more home ownership possibilities for those who want it.
Thanks, Joel. And it's not even scope creep. We want to look at the barriers to building ADUs that exist now, while still having standards that help them relate to their context and fit in. But there are some standards that certainly have been identified already that are some of the reasons that we don't get more ADUs actually constructed.
I see Andrew's hand up.
Yes, Just real quick, just with the word starter home. I know we're just starting in the process, but sometimes I'm worried about a snowball getting bigger. And my only kind of thought with the word with a starter home is the type of product that you're talking about, right? Like a probably 1 bedroom, 1 bath ranch. I see a lot of people downsizing into it as well. And there's a lot of opportunity for that aging in place in that type of thing. And so I think I just think of the word beginning, and everyone's kind of at their own path. So there's no reason to kind of beat up a word, but I just wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah, that's great. One thing Dr. Cog talks a lot about, people aging but staying in their houses that are too big for them because there are no smaller options without uprooting themselves from their community.
And there are no like main floor masters. I mean, if you're looking at 2 stories or things like that, they're really tough to find. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think quiet density or, something like that will be brought up a lot, but it's all good stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate the discussion on nomenclature. I mean, we're definitely not satisfied with Residential Infill Project. I mean, the acronym is RIP, and it's just sort of not a great look publicly. So if you have a better name, something like Housing Options Project or whatever you think of in the night, feel free to send it our way.
Thanks. Ignacio.
Yeah, I just, this conversation, just a quick question. Can you have an instance in which you have an additional dwelling unit and then make that parcel a condominium?
There are places that are exploring that option. Yeah, some other municipalities that have found a way to sort of skirt the rules where you essentially create your own HOA on your own property. It's something in the state covenants, but locally I'm not aware of it being done. But if there's a will, there's a way, I believe.
As a general comment, this is Don. Zoning and land use is power that's given to you by your left hand, and condominiums is with the right hand, and they can be mixed and matched in a whole variety of ways. So.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for staying to this long meeting. I wish Susan Stanton could be here to participate in this this next journey. Any announcements from Annalise?
Yeah, thank you, Joel. So we've now had 2 very long meetings in a row, and they have not had multiple agenda items. They've had 1 or 3 in this case. So in an attempt to try to get our meetings to a more manageable time, because we understand the commitment of volunteer boards, we are looking to add an additional date in September. That would be September 30th. And we do have interest from our applicants in moving up. And part of that is we've been booking cases that are applicant driven over 2 months out from when they're requesting those dates. So part of this is balancing and ensuring that we're providing due process and good customer service, but also trying to minimize these really long agendas that we're asking you guys to participate in. So I will send out a follow-up email tomorrow or early next week formally confirming the 30th, but I just want to put it on your radar. The other week we did send out an inquiry to kind of see who would be available, and we do have enough folks that could make that date to make a quorum. So I just wanted to put that on people's radars. And just once again, thank you all for your thoughtful dialogue, comments. Our projects would not be what they are without all of your contributions. So that is all that I have. And I hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.